Hi, everyone. Firstly, thank you for giving me this opportunity to come and speak to you guys all about economics and finance and debate. I think, yeah, so let me just do a little bit of an introduction as to who I am and what I'm kind of doing here. My name's Niki Linganur, and I originally come from Australia, but I do a lot of debate on the US debate circuit, especially the Northeast particularly. I debate for the University of Rochester, which is upstate New York. And I'm an honors economics student, so I do a lot of economics. That being said, I think that debate, especially over the last few years, has sort of gravitated towards a lot of economics and finance debates as a whole. And I think that this particular sort of motion or motion area often tends to scare students, especially those of us who perhaps are not as familiar with taking economics or knowing so much about finance. There is a few things so the way that I'm going to sort of structure this workshop today is, I know that there was a few questions that came in about COVID particularly, and how economics and finance debates are going to sort of be structured around that. But so the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to talk a little bit about, firstly, how economics as a whole sort of differs from debate economics and how you should make that distinction and how that ensures, how you can do that to ensure to get the one or the two in place in the top half of all debates. And then I'll talk a little bit about particularly pertinent and normal debate motions and areas that you tend to get them from. So I'll talk a little bit about free trade. I'll talk a little bit about economic sanctions and trade wars, tariffs, and then we will talk a little bit about trade blocks and IMFs, and then lastly sort of end on bailout policies, because I think that's very pertinent to COVID right now. And then at the end, I'm just going to do a little bit about what you should do in the fail-safe world where perhaps you get a motion about something that you absolutely have no idea about, which is pertaining to economics, and how you can probably still come off taking either the one or the two in those rounds, even if you know absolutely nothing about that motion or you know nothing about economics as a whole. At the end, I would be very happy to take questions. That being said, if whilst I'm talking something is very unclear or you would like further clarification or something, please either put it in the POI chat or just like unmute yourself and just like feel free to pause me and like jump right in and ask for the questions. So hopefully that's a little clear. So I'm just going to jump right into it, and let's talk a little bit firstly before we even start the debate workshop as to what the difference is between economics and finance as a whole and economics and finance particularly within debate. So I think that there's one large difference here, right? And this is something that I think people often forget, because even really structured economics students or finance students tend to make these mistakes where they forget that debate in economics, we often only care about three things. We either care about how a particular state or nation is affected, or we care about how international relationships are affected, so the relationship that two states may have amongst themselves or a multilateral set of states may have, or we care about how a particular group of minorities or a particular group of marginalized individuals or a particular group of like middle-class citizens within a state are affected. Those are the extents to which we care about economics. That is to say that any fancy like central banks, like inflation credit ratings or any of that, none of that is usually pertinent unless it affects a particular set of people that we care about in any given debate. So the stakeholder is very important. And I think this is where really good, technically sound economics and like finance majors fall out of debates, because they go on very long rants about why something is particularly true without telling an adjudicator why they ought to care about that in a particular debate that is pertinent to a stakeholder. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. And I think that's how you can ensure that you are always sort of winning rounds, tying it back to the stakeholder. That's really important, right? So that being said, I'm going to move firstly straight into the first sort of concept that I wanted to discuss today, which is on free trade. So free trade debates are actually really important. And I think that these are one of the things that you see on a global sense. And we've started seeing a lot more over the last few, especially over the last few years, I think, particularly as the world is becoming more and more globally like integrated, right? So what is free trade is to begin with? So again, I think I'm assuming with this workshop that all of you have some like basic understanding of economics. That being said, if anybody needs further clarification, please feel free to just like POI chat or just like put your hand up and tell me that you want more clarification. I'd be happy to clarify it, right? But with free trade, what does that actually mean? I think it's kind of simple here. In any debate round, we are usually talking about free trade as trade with no restrictions. So that's like allowing for free export, but like with no or very little restriction, I would say. So that's saying like imports and exports being allowed at both time, right? I think this is really important to remember that, like, here's the distinction that you would make in a debate round that you probably would not make in your economics 101 class, right? In your, like, I don't know, like econ 101. Politically, liberal economic policies and like political parties that are for liberal economic policies are usually for free trade, and nationalist governments are usually against free trade, and they cite things like protectionism. So this looks like, in the real world, like governments like Jair Bolsonaro from Brazil probably being against free trade because he's more nationalist in sentiment, right? So this is like also similar to like Poland's leader right now, which is all like Hungary's leader right now, which are all leading towards protectionist measures because they are more nationalist. That is a safe assumption to make in debate, and that is something that is usually helpful in political /IR and economics debate. So that's very good to remember, right? That being said, what then is like the way in which people stop free trade? One of the most frequent things that one hears in debates is something called a tariff. I'm pretty sure everyone here has heard of it. It is simply a tax on imports and exports between sovereign states, right? So this is a regulation of foreign trade to protect or safeguard a domestic industry. So what does that look like? So if you have import and export happening between two countries, oftentimes a state will put on a tariff on the on the importing good to protect the domestic nation's industries. That's really important. And that like probably helps safeguard the domestic interests, right? One good thing to keep in mind in terms of debates, and like I think especially in debates where people would like to use a lot of examples, is I've often seen people who are sort of struggle to come up with nations that do a lot of free trade. They use examples like the United States, or they use examples like Australia, or they use examples like India. These are all good countries, but they aren't necessarily the best countries to show where free trade happens. So free trade tends to happen in like a lot of these countries. I'm just going to list a few for you. States like Singapore, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Sweden, Finland, Austria, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Belgium are all states which are very high in terms of like free trade and constant free trade. So these are good states to mention. Try and stay away from states like the United States or like Australia. Those do exist, but I think that they're on comparative. There's a lot of better states that you could probably provide for examples. So then what is like important in debates pertinent to free trade? Because you will always see these. I think particularly you're likely to see these as like stock motions, or even motions that might just be altered a little bit, like specific to a specific country or something like that, right? So oftentimes you are asked to debate whether free trade is a good thing or free trade is a bad thing, right? And if anyone's taking the side of like, so say you're opposition and you're trying to take the side of why free trade might be a bad thing, usually you would use something called protectionism as an argument. Now, there are two ways to make this argument. You either make it on an economic basis or you make this on a moral basis, right? So in terms of economic basis, what are some of the arguments that you might choose to run here? So the first sort of argument that you could run is that it would destroy infant industries, or it would destroy domestic industries, right? So if you are trading too much, I think that your domestic industry or your infant industry at home would be largely affected, and that's probably a bad thing. That's an economic argument. Another economic argument might be something along the lines of long-run economic development is hurt in the home environments, right? The home countries. That's quite important to like bear in mind too. That's another economic argument. Another economic argument could be something like income inequality rises disproportionately. This is likely to happen in a lot of developing nations, particularly where the wage gap is very, the wage gap between the middle class and the like upper middle class within a state is very high, right? Because when you have imports, this probably is only further exacerbated, and that's really good to remember too. Moving on to more moral arguments, and I think that these are things that I think people often are feeling more confident with, because especially with people who don't necessarily understand economics as a whole, moral arguments can be something that people are very comfortable running. Now, there tends to be this misconception that moral arguments are not going to win you the round. That is not true in any which way. I have been in, okay, so I see a POI, I see a POI as to why the long-term economy is hurt. Right, that's a great question. So the reason why your long-term economy or long-term economic development would be hurt is because if a state is always investing on like importing goods and is always like trying to make life easier for import goods to come in, oftentimes it means it is not diverting resources to developing its local economy, which hurts its long-term development, right? It hurts things like job provision. It helps things like agricultural building. So that's all bad for the long-term economy development. Hopefully that answers that question. Perfect, no problems. So then I think what I was trying to say is these are all like really good economic ways to answer those questions. These were like the first three economics things that I said. But that being said, there are also moral ways to debate this and still win this. I think a lot of people severely underestimate the power and persuasion of moral arguments in rounds with free trade, right? And I think the reason why this is true is I've been in really good WDC rooms where moral arguments have simply pushed us through the nexus, right? And I think the reason why this is so pertinent is because moral arguments are so much easier to tie back to the stakeholder, right? That is to say, it is much harder to prove why economic growth or long-term economic growth is going to necessarily help like a marginalized community, but it is much easier to prove why a moral harm is like pertinent to everyone, right? So it's much easier to tie it back to the stakeholder group. And so that sorry, there's someone on mute. Unless you have a question, I would ask, sorry, I'm not muted. Unless you have a question, I would ask you to just stay on mute. That'd be helpful. Yeah, so the moral harm here is, so the reason why moral arguments are like very persuasive is because it's easier to tie them back to, it's because it's easier to tie those back to the economy themselves, right? So what are the moral sorts of harms that you could use for free trade specifically for moral arguments? So I think the first thing you could use is something along with environmental degradation. This is becoming more and more popular. If anyone has seen the recent like semi-final that's come out of the EUDC, like the last EUDC, there's a really well-run moral environmental degradation case coming out of the closing government. That's a really good one to watch. It's basically talking about how climate change in and of itself and like environmental legislations are far lax compared to like imports that are coming into the country, right? So environmental degradation is one that's really good to run. Another one is, and I think most people have seen this, is like talking about how we've sort of encouraged child labor and we encourage sweatshops when we allow for free trade a lot, because we are quite literally supporting a lot of sweatshops that might exist in other nations, right? So that's quite important. The last one is one that I don't think very many people run, but this can be very persuasive if done right. It's the idea of cultural change. When you have a lot of international trade and you have free trade happening, it means that oftentimes, especially coming from like a Western liberal democracy or something like, or like a state like the United States, when you bring a lot of these goods into developing nations, oftentimes there is a huge nexus in trade of cultural clash, right? That is to say, you have a lot of big MNCs that move into smaller developing nations and developing economies and sort of really impact out that, that really change the cultural shift there. And I think that cultural shift can mean to a lot of cultural erosion. It can lead to things like domestic values and systems and things like that being degraded. So that's a really good argument to run if impacted right? I just wanted to like give you guys an example of a motion that might potentially talk. So I just wanted to talk about a particular motion that might like show how free trade is being impacted. So one that was run very frequently, this was run at WUDC Thailand. So last year. And it was, this House supports the rapid global elimination of both tariff and non-tariff barriers to free trade. So basically this motion is asking you to argue why why free trade is a good thing. So it's asking for rapid like global expansion. Just give me 1 second, I'll answer this in a second. Sorry, yeah, Anushka, just give me 1 second, I'll answer it. But basically this motion is basically asking you to argue why it would be good to get rid of non-tariff and tariff borders and allow for free trade, but rapidly, right? So quite literally, we can see how this is the basic argument of, is free trade good or bad? It's just asking me to argue if it happened instantaneously versus if it happened gradually, right? This is a world's debate motion. So obviously this is something that has been thought out a little bit, but like obviously, you can sort of see how these are very stockish motions. So even if you can get the basic free trade debate sort of nailed in, that's something you can apply to a lot of other cases. Yes, I can repeat the motion. It was, this House supports the rapid global elimination of both tariff and non-tariff barriers to free trade. So literally just asking you to defend free trade, but rapidly, like not phased out, just immediately. So that's something that's kind of pertinent. The question above that was asked is, how can cultural change argument be impacted? Right. So I think here you can talk a little bit about, and I think it depends on what obviously what the motion is, but if it's asking you to perhaps defend it in a developing nation, then this is where you can sort of talk about imperialism. This is where you could talk about colonialist history. You could talk about narratives being erased. You could talk about minorities losing their culture. You could talk about a lot of like local domestic products that might be catered to a particular nation sort of being eroded. These are all ways that you could impact that argument. It is obviously pertinent on the motion, but if it is asking you specifically about developing nations, cultural change can be a really good thing to argue, just sort of on the decolonialist narrative sort of arguments. So that's quite really helpful. So that's kind of on free trade. I'm presuming that no one really has questions on free trade. Again, we can talk back about this at the end, but I'm just going to move on to the next thing, which is kind of pertinent to that, which is economic sanctions and trade wars. So I'm pretty sure that every single person on this group chat here has heard the concept of an economic sanction. These are withdrawals of trade and financial relations between nations. They are done through three main means. That is not to say that they're only done by three means, but three main means is the way that they're done. The first one is embargoes, which is like a physical, like a barrier to a particular type of good being imported. Tariffs, which is what we just talked about, it's like an additional tax, and quotas, which is like a limitation based off how much can be imported, right? So embargoes, tariffs, and quotas are usually the way that which sanctions are kind of imposed, right? Why are they imposed? These are really good questions. These are more like, so I'm sort of stepping in, like when I said I was doing economics, I'm also obviously talking about IR and politics because all three are very closely linked in debate at least. So why are economic sanctions usually imposed? For a few reasons. Firstly, they could be there for counterterrorism. They could be there for nuclear non-proliferation. This is very, very pertinent, especially with the case of like North Korea. You can see how the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, Japan, a lot of other states have imposed that on North Korea, and those continue to exist because of nuclear non-proliferation. There we go. The next reason is it could be for human rights promotion or democracy promotion. This is particularly pertinent in current status quo to Eastern European states. So you see a lot of Western states adding or imposing sanctions on Eastern European states that are tending to go more like autocratic in nature. So you see this with Hungary, you see this with the Czech Republic sometimes, you see this with Poland and Croatia, sometimes Serbia as well, right? So these are all states where for human rights promotions or democracy promotion, as the West likes to call it, there are often economic sanctions that are placed. Also, they can be used for conflict resolution. So oftentimes, for example, with the South China Sea currently, you can see Australia imposing sanctions on China to try and mediate and find a resolution to conflicts, especially in like international waters and things like that. So conflict resolution. And the last one is very, very recent. And when I mean very recent, I literally mean in the last month or so. Very recent, you can sort of perhaps even expect a motion on this in the next few IVs and things like that, but stuff about cybersecurity. So if as anyone's sort of been reading up on the last few weeks, but for example, there's been a lot of breaches within like the Australian government in terms of China. There's been a lot of breaches in terms of Russia and the US. There's been a lot of breaches in terms of Russia and the UK. They've all been cybersecurity based. So now in terms of cybersecurity breaches, bigger states tend to impose sanctions on the smaller ones in that way. So why is it, like what types of sanctions can be imposed? There are two types of sanctions. These are really good to know because I think if you're an opening government team in a sanctions debate, it can be really helpful to outline and model exactly what kind of sanction you're going to place, right? Because this can be, it's strategic for a few reasons. So firstly, if you can outline what kind of sanction you're imposing, I think you can target the group that you want to target a lot better. It makes an opening opposition's life a lot harder to defend. Secondarily, it makes it a lot easier for you to be able to prove your burden to the crux, right? That is to say, if you have a comprehensive sanction, for example, it's a lot harder to prove. So what are the two types of sanctions and how do they usually work? So the first kind of sanction is a comprehensive sanction. That basically means you stop all forms of importing and exporting going from one state to another state. These are largely unsuccessful. These are largely unheard of, right? The one time that I can sort of think of in the back of my head where it was successful was back in 1995 when the United States placed a sanction on the former Yugoslavia. This worked like a very long time ago. I don't know if those are like still like physically possible to happen. The last tried attempts was by the United States to impose one on Cuba. It wasn't as successful. This basically is very hard to impose because imagine just sort of like what the implications here are, right? If you are stopping all imports and exports from a nation to another nation, that's very hard to impose. It's good to remember that. The next type is called the targeted sanction. And that these are far more common, right? You see targeted sanctions from the United States to North Korea. You see targeted sanctions. Perhaps the most recent ones were the ones on from the United States to China in terms of stopping steel sanctions. So those were all very recent. That was in 2019. So those things happened, right? Now, the next really important thing to understand about sanctions and like themselves is when do you get a trade war and what is a trade war, right? So sanctions don't always work, right? I mean, ideally you want to stay, like ideally a state wants them to work, but sometimes they just don't work. When is it likely that a sanction works? A sanction usually works when the target nation is much smaller and is very dependent on the state that is imposing the sanction, right? So if it's a much smaller state and you have a much larger state that is imposing a sanction on it and its economy is dependent on that, obviously that will affect the smaller state's economy and the sanction will work. If both states are equally dependent on each other, or both states are equally powerful in terms of IR or even in terms of finance, you get something called a trade war, right? Why do you get a trade war? Because when one state imposes a sanction, the other one is also likely to retaliate and impose another sanction, right? This is what we call the trade war in economics. And you can see one currently in status quo. You can see a few actually in status quo. You can see one between the United States and China. You can see one between the United Kingdom and China. You can see one between Australia and China right now, right? So these are all like reasonable trade wars, to quote unquote, where you see both states applying sanctions. Obviously, applying sanctions comes with its own harms. It literally comes with things like it means that goods are much more expensive for people to access now because there's no imports that are coming in. It means that domestic industries all of a sudden are being forced to keep up with like incredible demands. That means that people all of a sudden are like probably being employed. That's probably a net positive, but there's a lot of positives and negatives obviously to imposing sanctions. These are really easily found by just doing a quick Wikipedia search. I didn't want to bore people through this. I just wanted to talk in terms of like the debate strategy of this, right? The debate strategy of sanctions is to remember that they will only work if a big state imposes them on a smaller state that is not dependent on it, that is very dependent on its economy, right? Otherwise, it's likely to fail. This is really good refutation to do if a team quite literally cites that we're going to do sanctions and gives you no mechanisms as to how it's going to work. This is a good way to just quickly refute that and move on to the next part of the case, right? So this is really good refutation. So that's kind of on economic sanctions and trade wars. Did anyone have any questions on that? All right, I'm going to take that as a no. Just give me 1 second. Okay, perfect. Let's move on to the next thing then, which I had was trade blocks in and of itself, right? So what are trade blocks? So trade blocks kind of sound like are quite intuitive by their names. They're quite literally small regions of the globe where you have multiple states that coincide and come together and eliminate all or some barriers to trade, right? So that literally looks like tariffs and like quotas and embargoes, all of those sort of being eliminated or drastically reduced, right? What are the advantages to trade blocks? So the advantages to trade blocks, or actually before that, let's talk about a few trade blocks that might exist. Good trade, so trade blocks that I think most of you might be familiar with are things like NAFTA, things like TPP, things like ASEAN, things like BRICS. These are all trade blocks. You could also say the EU itself is a trade block. So all of these are trade blocks where you see multiple states coming together and sort of trading freely with the absence of barriers and things like that, right? So what are the advantages to trade blocks and what are the disadvantages to trade blocks? Because again, you sort of see motions on this. We'll talk through a few at the end of just motions which might be pertinent to trade blocks, right? So what are the advantages? So the first advantage that you face here is that you get more competition amongst the states, right? Why is that so? Because if China is going to produce plastic and is trading within BRICS, right? Likely Brazil is also producing plastic, so it also has to be equally competitive. Why is that important? Because it now means that you get things like efficiency, you get more development, you get more innovation. These are all necessarily good things in debate because we can impact them out as to how those help people, right? If you have development, that usually means you get better products, that's better like things for consumers, that's better goods and finished services for like the middle class citizens of the state, right? Remember that when you like impact these out, you impact them out again strategically. This is where we differentiate debate from economics, right? Make sure you explain how this affects the group of people that the motion is talking about, right? Like, so obviously don't just be like, okay, you get competition, you get efficiency. Tell me why that efficiency is important to a particular set of people. That's how you will take the 1 or the 2 versus the 3 or the 4, right? The next thing you get is you get something called economies of scale, right? Economies of scale is important. I think most people have heard of it. It's a very familiar concept. It's a very basic economics concept. It's when you produce mass in bulk, so the cost of producing each unit goes down, right? So that is to say, if I was going to produce, say like 15 like water bottles, each cost of a water bottle will come down for me. So it's much more efficient for me in terms of the corporation or state, right? So the economies of scale goes up. Because you are now producing so many things versus like a few things. Something else that happens is you get something called competitive advantage, right? Now, this is a little bit of a complicated phenomenon to understand, so I'm going to sort of walk people through it, right? Competitive advantage is it basically exists between 2 states that both produce separate goods but are particularly good at producing one good, right? So for example, say Bangladesh is very good at producing sandalwood, right? And say India is very good at producing wheat, right? So normally, if trade blocks did not exist, India would have to produce both sandalwood and wheat, right? Because it would need both to sustain its local consumption. But now that trade blocks exist, India can just produce wheat and Bangladesh can just produce sandalwood, and now you can trade between the 2, right? The positive here is that India is not very good at making sandalwood here, right? So now it means that they're far more efficient in producing one thing, and then Bangladesh can be more efficient about producing their one thing. So it just increases efficiency on both platforms when they trade, right? So that's a really interesting thing that people can often run. You see this run whenever competitive advantage is a really good argument to run when you get motions about a particular state either joining or leaving a trade bloc, right? So we can talk a little bit more about that when I get to the motions, but that's a really good thing to sort of like talk about then. The last advantage that is this is a little bit more financy, so I will walk people through it, but it's the idea of you get increased FDI. So FDI is foreign direct investment, and you get increased foreign direct investment when more states have faith in a regional bloc, right? So that is to say, perhaps normally Japanese investors will not invest in Brazil. But when Japanese investors know that Brazil is tied to the economies of China and India and Russia through BRICS, it is more likely that Japan invests in Brazil. So that is probably good for the home states, right? So that's a good thing to sort of run there. The disadvantages to trade blocs, however, is that firstly, there is a lot of interdependence between the states, right? Now, this is seen very clearly through the European Union. If anyone, like, hopefully people are doing some reading on the European Union because that is quite an important actor in status quo. But for example, Greece's currency or Greece's inflation rates are tied back to Germany's and France's, right? Because they all sort of trade within each other. Or Germany's like inflations and Germany's government policies are tied back to France's or Croatia's or like Luxembourg's, right? So all of those are sort of tied together. So there is interdependence, which can be good, but it can also be bad if a state is doing particularly poorly, right? The next thing that is the disadvantage here is that you get a lot of concessions that are usually extracted, right? So larger states can often bully smaller states into doing things as it sees fit. You see this mostly in ASEAN. So for example, in ASEAN, you see bigger states or more powerful states like Singapore sort of extract concessions from smaller states like Myanmar, right? Or Nepal. So these are really important to remember. This is really helpful, especially if you're running a lot of like IR or cross-nation extensions and things like that from back half. It's always important to remember how this might affect other states and how it works in the power play there. So let's talk through 2 motions that sort of talk about trade blocs. So the first one is, this House believes that Mexico ought to pull out of NAFTA. This was run at a regional US tournament a few years ago. So this is a really good motion to perhaps run something like competitive advantage, right? Mexico, for example, is one of the world's exporters, one of the world's leading exporters of, I think it's Honda cars, right? So obviously, if they were to pull out of NAFTA, they would lose that competitive advantage. This is something that you might be able to like sort of impact out and weigh out in the debate, right? Like obviously on Gov, right? Another example here is this House believes that China should join the TPP. So again, you might want to talk a little bit about competitive advantage, but this here, you could also talk about like interdependence. What does it do for China to be like sort of linked with all the other states, right? So these are all really good arguments to sort of talk about. This the one thing about trade blocks that I just want to conclude on is the idea that trade blocks and arguments to trade blocks are very, very interrelated with any international relations debate, right? These are the sort of debates that are it's very confusing whether it's an economics motion or whether it's an IR motion. It's usually a mixture of both, so it's good to treat them as both. So always sort of question yourself. If you ever see a trading motion, make sure you ask yourself, what is the general ramification you get on like a general society or a worldly view? Right? Those are really good to sort of know. Did anyone have any questions on like trade blocks? Okay, so I see the chat box is empty, so I'm going to take that as a no. All right, let's move on to the IMF and central banks, because I think that this is the stuff that actually sort of terrifies, especially novices, but also terrifies more experienced debaters who may just be very good at what they do, but I think that they just worry when they hear the words IMF and central banks, right? I promise they are not that scary. I promise once you understand them, it'll be very easy for you to use these in debates and perhaps just win rounds, right? So let's talk firstly about the IMF, right? So the IMF stands for the International Monetary Fund, and it is headquartered in Washington, DC in the United States and has 186 nations as of now. Its primary goals are monetary cooperation, the facilitation of international trade, economic growth, and establishing and maintaining balance of payments for each state that is a part of. So what does that actually do, right? It provides loans. It provides balance of payments for each state, and like ensures that balance of payments are met for each state. These loans are often short or medium term and are funneled and fueled mainly by the quota contributions made by each of the states that take part in the IMF, right? The only stipulation to the IMF itself is that sovereign immunity is required. That is to say that the IMF only takes part in foundation schemes and like allows like loan provisions only if it is protected by sovereign immunity. That is to say that it obviously cannot be tried in any of those regional like courts and things like that, systems of trial. So what are the benefits of like recent benefits that the IMF has sort of done, right? So I'm not sure how many people here are sort of acquainted with it, but there was the Nepal money laundering process in 2015, where the IMF not only helped fund cleaning up all the reserves, but cleaning up all like the black money reserves and things like that, but also helped a lot of the probing and investigation initially. The IMF provided a lot of funds to sort of help that, right? As a result, Nepal currently has far less black money per capita than all its neighboring states, including Myanmar, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, right? And this was like obviously a win-win for Nepal, but also for the IMF because it bolsters its image and makes it look good. More people were willing to join. I think after the 2015 cleanup in Nepal, I think it was something like 6 to 7 Southeast Asian nations joined this petition. What does protected by sovereign immunity mean? Yes, of course. Sovereign immunity basically means that the IMF goes in and provides loans and helps meet balance of payments, but itself does not take any responsibility for doing so, right? So that is to say, it could not be tried in a local court. It could not be tried in like the Supreme Courts, like those sorts of things, right? It does not face the same legislation that other banks would or other funds would. So that's kind of what it means. Okay, so then let's talk about the consequences, because although the IMF does do things like the Nepal Money Laundering Fund, it also sometimes does things that aren't very palatable and aren't very good, right? So one of the consequences that happened was the Argentina fiscal restraints that happened in 2008. It basically, what it did is it forced Argentina into stringent policy offsets and fiscal restraints. That is to say, what it did is it sort of stopped the government from investing in welfare programs and funds and things like that. And what that did is it declined the investment in public services, which obviously hurt the long-term economy of Argentina, which it's still sort of recovering from, right? So that's obviously not a very good thing. That hurt. So obviously we've seen sort of like both sides of this, how the IMF can be both helpful but also detrimental, right? Let's then talk a little bit about central banks, because I think that's sort of like linked to IMFs, right? Central banks are also known as reserve banks. In India, it's called the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India. And what its primary function is to manage the currency and monetary policies of any given state. It has a monopoly in increasing monetary base in financial crises. What does that mean? That means that it can often increase the amount or the regulation of money printing. It can do things that are, especially at a time of financial crisis, like financial stipulations and things like that, right? That's when usually a reserve bank or central bank comes in play. Now, one of the common misunderstandings in BP debate, and the amount of times judges laugh at this is like very high, is when people say that that central banks set interest rates. They do not set interest rates, they influence market interest rates. What's the difference, right? The difference is the IMF, like for example, the central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, for example, does not get up one day and go, okay, we want to set the interest rate at X amount. They do not do that. What they do is they lend and borrow money or sell and purchase bonds to influence what the interest rate is, right? So they don't directly set it. Instead, they lend and borrow money, or they set and purchase bonds, like government bonds, national bonds, security bonds, any of those, right? The reason why this is a good differentiation to make is because if you ever hear that in a debate, it is very it's very helpful and strategic for you to quickly mention that that's probably now not how it functions. It is much more pertinent to just like explain how lending and borrowing of money works, or how selling and purchasing of bonds work, because then you can bring in all that analysis by that, right? So that's quite important. A good example of a motion that might talk about, a motion that could talk about central banks here is this House believes that central banks should set limits on government spending. This was a motion that was set at NAUDC, so the North American United Debates, North American, NAUDC, I don't actually know what it stands for, but it's the North American Debate Championships. And it was, this is basically asking you to debate the idea of whether a central bank ought to have the power to regulate how much a government spends. So obviously within government spending, we're talking things like welfare, we're talking things like subsidies, we're talking things like unemployment benefits, those sorts of things, right? So should a central bank have that power, or should it set limits on government spending, yes or no? I think that a lot of the things that we just talked about and those examples that I gave you earlier really help sort of flesh out those arguments, right? So that's kind of helpful. So that's kind of what I had on IMF and central banks. It's really important to remember not to be scared by institutions like this. Just remember that they are directly responsible for governing a state's monetary policy, not a fiscal policy, right? That's really important to make that difference. All right, lastly, let's talk a little bit about bailout policies, because these are really important. And I think particularly right now in the middle of COVID, these are even more important. What is a bailout policy, right? And I think this is probably, and I'll be very honest, these are the kinds of motions that I think CAs set in like semifinals or quarterfinals, or like, I don't know, like round 5s or round 6s, like the last round of a prelim, right? Just to sort of check if people A, are reading up and keeping up with reading, and B, to just sort of like weed out people who don't understand basic economics and finance, right? So these are really good to understand. So what is a bailout policy? A bailout policy is when a business, an individual, or a government provides money or resources to a failing corporation. That money that they provide is often called a capital injection or injunction, right? However, it does come often with a stipulation, right? So that is to say that businesses, individuals, or governments don't just provide this money with absolutely no conditions. They do put in some conditions. Hold on. I'll answer the question about central banks in a bit. Let me just finish bailout policies and I'll come back because I've already sort of started this. So let's talk about what are those conditions that people put on and why, what are those stipulations and why they're so important, right? So some of these stipulations, they can range drastically. Obviously, it depends on who's enforcing, who's paying these bailouts, right? Whether it's businesses, whether it's individuals, whether it's the government, right? But usually it tends to be things like banning stock buyback. What is stock buyback? It's often when a corporation sells its stocks and then buys them back to artificially increase the price of their stocks, right? So something like that. Or to limit executive compensation. So this can be seen especially in larger firms, especially consultation groups like McKinsey or Bain & Co., like a lot of those places, where literally it's limiting how much money executives themselves garner, right? And sometimes things like ensuring environmental legislations or like welfare legislations and regulations are met. Usually the government does those sorts of things, right? So these are the sorts of conditions that governments, individuals, or businesses sort of impose upon failing corporations in order to get the bailout policies enacted, right? So what are the consequences to bailing out firms? So, because I think the positives here are kind of clear, right? So if a firm is failing and we sort of stop them from failing, obviously like jobs are not lost, right? Like economies are sort of still, sorry, the economy stays equally stimulated and things like that. So I think the positives are kind of clear here, but I think that the negatives are what most debaters sort of struggle with, right? So there's a few things. The first thing, and this is probably the first thing that every opening team will run, but it's the idea of it is very costly, right? Because in order to bail out large firms, realize that usually bailouts happen in the middle of financial crises, right? So right now, in the middle of COVID, there is a lot of firms that are sort of like collapsing. Like, I think people have seen this left, right, and center. There's a lot of firms that have sort of gone under. There's a lot of small businesses and even large businesses that are suffering huge losses. So in a time where funds are already sort of restricted because of financial, like financial crises or like government pandemics or whatever it is, government misallocation of resources, there is usually not very much money. So it is very costly to spend on these particular corporations, right? So that I think that that's the first thing, the cost aspect. Here's often where you will hear teams say a term that is very used in debate. It's often misused, but this is also an argument that can just be applied to a lot of motions. It doesn't need to be just economic motions. It's usually applied across the spectrum. It's called opportunity cost, right? And opportunity cost is basically defined by the next best alternative, foregone, right? So that is to say, the opportunity cost of me staying here and talking to you at 12 a.m. my time is that I could be sleeping, right? I obviously enjoy speaking to you all, but that's the opportunity cost, right? The opportunity cost is the thing that you are foregoing from doing another thing. Oftentimes, this in economics and finance debates is placed in terms of the finance and the capital that you invest. So the opportunity cost of the government bailing out firms is perhaps like a stipulation, or is perhaps like a stimulus or something like that it could provide to its citizens instead. Or the opportunity cost of bailouts might be the amount of money that the government could reinvest into healthcare, or the amount of money that the government could reinvest into education or infrastructure, things like that, right? That's the opportunity cost. That's always really good to know. Because I think that is also applicable in debates that aren't economics. It's good to just know that, right? So what are some good examples of bailout policies in and of themselves, right? So I think that over the last few years, two of them are either the Irish banking rescue or the Swedish banking rescue, where again, a lot of firms themselves were sort of under, and both the Irish and Swedish governments sort of helped them out and bailed them out, right? Those are good examples of where it was successful, and that can be quite helpful. Now, in terms of a motion for bailout policies, this was actually set at the Eastern Online Ivy by a good friend of mine a few months ago, actually. It's just at the start of the pandemic, and I think this is very good COVID-related stuff, because I was sort of going to transition into COVID material now. But just like talking about this particular motion. So the motion itself was, this House believes that governments should not condition COVID-related bailouts of the private sector on major corporate reforms. Example, limiting executive compensation, banning stock buybacks, etc. So basically what that's asking you to argue is whether the government should not impose those stipulations that we talked about earlier on COVID-related bailouts of corporations, right? So you should just bail them out. There shouldn't be any conditions. You're allowed to do that openly. I think what's really good here is it's basically asking you, is it good to bail out people, yes or no? But the only additional stipulation that you have to this motion is this: should there be conditions? Like, should we do it without conditions, or should we do it like not do it at all, right? Like that's the alternative and counterfactual. I think that you can run a lot of those arguments here. Two other negative arguments to not doing bailout policies are the following, right? So the first thing is that sometimes centralized bureaucracies are formed because of bailout policies, right? So because you have bailout policies enacted by the government, that often means the government gets direct control as to which businesses survive and which ones don't survive. Now, this is not usually a problem in Western liberal democracies, or even democracies like India most of the times, right? It does tend to be a problem in more autocratic states or states that are leaning more right? So for example, this would probably be a problem in Brazil. This would probably be a problem in Poland. This would probably be a problem in Croatia or Hungary, right? Because these are all states where the state itself has a vested interest in trying to keep certain industries alive and certain industries to collapse because of political reasons, right? So that's the idea of centralized bureaucracies themselves being formed because of bailout policies that are enacted by the government. Because the government gets to choose who they survive and who they capsize, oftentimes that means they have direct control over a state, over an economy, right? And that's probably bad. The next thing, and this one is a very underused argument in any bailout motion, but it's one that is quite effective, right? Because this isn't an economic argument. My debate partner from debate didn't very much like economics while we debated. So he would always run, where possible, moral arguments because they were a lot easier for him to just synthesize. We actually ended up doing reasonably well because I don't think very many people know how to refute moral arguments in economics debates. So this is a good alternative for anyone who does not want to run just pure economics, right? This kind of argument is called the moral hazard argument, right? Why it's called the moral hazard argument is because it's kind of intuitive, right? There is a moral hazard that is imposed upon people when we bail out corporations. Because corporations know that they do not need to pay the cost of their actions, that often means that they take more risk, or they have an incentive to bear a risk because they do not need to bear the cost of their actions later, like reap the cost of their actions, right? Because they know that no matter what I do, the government will bail me out or other people will bail me out. Obviously, this is an argument that needs to be very well impacted and obviously mechanized and weighed out to the opposition. But if used correctly, I think that this can be very crucially damning or even like fatal to opposition teams, right? So this is a really good argument, sort of right. So that's the stuff on bailout policies. The reason why I decided to do a whole section on bailout policies is because I think bailout policies are particularly pertinent over the next few months. It sadly looks like we are going to be stuck in a COVID era for a bit. And I think that bailout policies are particularly pertinent, especially in a world where we are probably going to have to sort of reckon with what do we do with all the businesses that are going under right now, and what is the best way to save them, or is it even worth it to save these businesses, right? So I think that that's something important. How would one oppose the moral hazard? Okay, hold on, there's a lot of questions. All right, how would one oppose the moral hazard argument? Okay, so I think that there's a few ways to oppose this, right? So I think the first way that you could oppose this would be being like, firstly, firms don't always know that you are going to bail out everyone, right? So the government cannot simply bail out every single firm. So firms would not have the guarantee that the government would bail them out, right? And so firms, because they operate on a profit incentive, they wouldn't want to take that risk to begin with. So I think that's pretty, that one's pretty fair. I think another way you could probably refute the moral hazard argument is something along the lines of, even if they have a higher incentive to risk, that also probably means that they have a higher incentive to reward, because higher risk means higher reward. That one takes a little bit more work to build, but that is something that you could definitely run. So these are all like a few hypotheticals. Obviously, you could. This would also depend on exactly how one ran the moral hazard argument. I'm just going back to the very basic argument here. Hopefully that answers that. Are there examples where corporations took more risk because of bailouts? Yes, there are. There are a few energy corporations in Australia which at 2008, things like Origin Air, things like Green Life Air, things like City West Water, a lot of those corporations in Australia after 2008 did take higher risk, did things like investment to solar energy and like places which perhaps were not the most safest of investments, and were expecting bailouts in terms of the Australian government. Some of those corporations were bailed out by the government. Some were not, and did just go under and never recover. So that's a few examples. You could also obviously Google this. I'm just sort of going off the few examples that I remember off the top of my head. So sorry if I'm not super helpful there, but hopefully that helped to some degree. Could you elaborate more on the difference between monetary and fiscal policy? Sure. Let me get back to that one in a second, because that one's not directly tied back to this one, but I will elaborate on that in a second. So just let me get through that one. Hold on, there was a argument. Okay, so on the previous question from, I'm gonna butcher this name, I'm sorry for butchering your name, Som Ukil, I think that's your name. What about setting up how these central banks are formed and who runs them? Right, so central banks are reserve banks, right? So they often are set up by the state and are run by by the people appointed to run them, right? So like there's a reserve bank, what's his name? I really don't remember the guy that just took over, but one of them recently took over in India, right? So these are like you don't set them up. The state quite literally essentially sets them up, and they are formed initially. And then the state, there is one that is just elected by a board. That's usually what happens. All right, okay, hold on, let me go through that one. Can you explain what a moral hazard is again, please? Yes, I can. So a moral hazard is a moral way to take down an argument about why bailouts sometimes ought not be applied, right? So the argument follows is that a corporation would have an incentive to increase its risk because it doesn't need to bear the cost of its actions, right? So if the government is always bailing out corporations, or an individual or state, or like a business, someone is bailing out like a risky actor, the firm that is currently going under has a greater incentive to take risks, or has a greater incentive to not act responsibly, because it knows that it does not need to bear the cost. It knows that it does not need to pay itself out. It knows that it will not go under. So that is a good argument to be like, okay, well, this is probably a reason why we shouldn't bail them out. That just means that they're going to make more risky decisions. That means that that's probably not good for the state, right? It's just a loss on the state's part. So that's kind of what a moral hazard argument is. Hopefully that was clear to Ashi. Yeah, give me 1 second. Yeah, so Sanika, you asked what a dual mandate is. So a dual mandate is when elected officials often serve in more than one position, right? There are multiple positions under like a central bank or any financial institution that's set up by the state. A dual mandate is when an individual serves in more than one of those. That is rarely, this is like, so I think a few of these questions, like for example, the dual mandate stuff, these are things that I do not think you will rarely see in debates. The reason why you will rarely see these, like if you see these in debates, that is literally some finance or econ bro just like saying a lot of financial terms to you. These are not things that would probably win or lose you the debate. What wins and loses you debate is the actual constructive case and argumentation. This is why I went through the basic like sort of clashes. Give me 1 second. I think that it basically what it does is it sort of like the clashes of the debate. I think that's why I was walking through like the general ideas of like sorts of debates that you see. Small economic financial terms. Obviously there's a bunch that I'm skipping over today because of time, but also because I didn't want to bore anyone or put anyone to sleep. I get that economics and finance isn't always the funnest thing to talk about. But a lot of these small terms and like very clear, like crucial, like economic terms, these are things that are probably not going to be weighed or constructed in debates, right? What is more important is, again, like I said, what directly helps or hurts the stakeholder. And again, if there is something super technical, you usually get an info slide or just a word clarification on the info slide that helps you clarify that. Sorry for the follow. If the state sets up the central bank, how is it supposed to limit the expenditure of the government? Yeah, so when I say state, oh, sorry, I should very clearly clarify this. When I say state, in North America, we usually go state is a government, right? Like a state is a nation. So if a government So when it says it limits, it's basically saying it would set a cap to what the government itself spends that particular year, right? Again, this is very based off the opening government model. In the debate that I adjudicated in this round, it was something like they would elect an official, the elected official would set up a bar in terms of like the amount of like per GDP spending that they would implement, and that's how it would be like a state if exceeded would like face penalties or something like that, right? So again, this is very up to modeling. This debate is obviously up to like the opening government to model. It's something along the lines of that though. Like I don't think that you would get anything that's drastically different in terms of that. Okay, cool. I think I've answered most of the questions. I'm just going back to see if there was something. Sorry, my chat box is a little weird. Just want to make sure I can read that. Okay, I think there is one question that I didn't explain. Very quickly then, what's the difference between a monetary and fiscal policy? So the monetary policy is influenced by the central bank of a government. It's the Reserve Bank. Monetary policies usually often affect things like interest rates that are set by the government, often affect rates like the amount of money that is printed and put out in like in supply and circulation. That's what a monetary policy is. A fiscal policy is things that are like, for example, the collection of like, it's when governments adjust like spending levels, and you have like tax rates that monitor and influence a nation's economy, right? So like things like taxation rates, things like welfare spending, a lot of that stuff, that all comes out of fiscal policies. Those are not controlled by the central bank. So that's the large difference between those two. I also think that a lot of these things, so some of these things I didn't actually go in through. So I didn't actually go through monetary and fiscal policy because there are a lot of workshops on those previously in terms of economics and finance. So I wanted to keep them more to things that I hadn't seen. So I looked through a few of these. If you are very interested in a lot of these basic clashes, so things like monetary and fiscal policy, or things like what like currency controls and things like look like, I think those are very basic things. If you go online and you check up European debate training videos, I think there's a few provided by some really good speakers and good friends of mine who have walked through those in like very clear detail. But those workshops are all like 20 minutes and they're only about those particular things. Just because I had a very like constrained time cap, I kind of wanted to keep it to strategy within debate economics here. But if you do want to learn about those concepts, please feel free to jump onto that platform. It's European Debate Circuit training videos or something. If you just type it on YouTube, you should find it, and there's a lot of videos just linked back to like the difference between a monetary and fiscal policy. Yeah, cool. I think I've answered most of these questions. If I did miss your question and I didn't answer it, please okay, could you explain the Argentina example under the IMF again? Yeah, hold on 1 second, let me find my paper. Where was I? Okay. Yeah, so what happened in Argentina in terms of the IMF was that the IMF forced stringent policies onto Argentina, right? Like stringent fiscal policies. So that is to say that they stopped things like investment in public services by the state because they wanted to regulate the balance of payments by like within the state, right? So what this did is that obviously hurt its long-term economic growth because the state wasn't investing in things like agriculture, infrastructure, or education, right? So obviously that hurt Argentina in the long run because they didn't have a very good like economic infrastructure base that was developed. So that was kind of the harmful example there. Again, for more specific examples, obviously there is like 60,000 examples that I could provide, which I don't think are specifically helpful to you. I think it's more helpful if I can talk you through strategy. But if you do want more examples, please feel free to just like jump online and type up examples of like IMF. It's like a quick Google search that will yield you a lot of examples. Yeah, so that's kind of like the stuff I had on policies itself. Now I wanted to talk a little bit specifically in terms of strategy, what to do if all else fails, and then let's talk a little bit more in terms of COVID and just general things that you should know in terms of COVID. I'm going to start firstly with the COVID stuff, and then we can talk at the end about strategy, and then just some quick stuff about what to do if everything else goes wrong in a debate round, in terms of economics, obviously. Okay, let's talk about COVID quickly, because I did hear from the organizers of this tournament that there was a lot of questions about COVID and the sorts of things that you could expect, right? So some things that I'm not going to go into detail here. These are much more things that again, I think you can very quickly find through a quick Google search. I'm going to walk through like very briefly of these. If people have very specific questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I'll answer them, right? But some general things in terms of COVID and economics that you should probably know. So I think the first thing is bailout policies, which we sort of discussed and I did spend specific time on, because I think bailout policies particularly are probably pertinent all across the world. So that is to say, regardless of which tournament you do where, obviously I do not do too many debate tournaments on the Indian circuit, so I'm not entirely sure what like adj-cores here tend to set. But that being said, I know that these bailout policies are quite popular across the world. I've been to a few Malaysian tournaments where they're run, been to Australs where they are very frequently run. So yeah, this is something that you can expect. That's quite helpful. Another thing that is very helpful to learn and very helpful to know is healthcare supplies right now, right? So what does the supply structure of healthcare look like? Again, I think that a lot of this stuff is more pertinent back to international relations and sort of seeing who is supplying healthcare to who. So one of the things that's really happening right now, and this might be a good, like if anyone's taking notes or stuff, just like maybe asterisk this and do some reading on your own about this, but it's currently the European Union is actually being, is trying to pass a stimulus package in terms of trying to provide healthcare supplies and PPE and protection and things like that and aid to a lot of European states, especially Eastern European states like Serbia and Kosovo and Croatia, a lot of those states. But China itself is actually trying to supply them too, and there tends to be, there's a little tension there in that area in terms of healthcare provision. The reason why this would count as economics is it would count in terms of which state has a competitive advantage in terms of supplying that, those equipment, right? So for example, the reason why China is able to supply a lot of that aid or is able to get across a lot of those materials to these states is because China is able to produce those at a much lower cost than like states like France and Germany, which are trying to provide it in terms of the EU. This is really important because if Eastern European states receive a lot of aid from China, that has a lot of ramifications between how Eastern European states treat the EU and China, right? So these are good things to know. So just sort of doing some reading up on healthcare supplies and seeing how those kind of affect are really helpful. The next thing to sort of read up on here is also this idea of workforce. So for example, a lot of workforce, like a lot of, obviously because of COVID, a lot of people have been laid out, a lot of people have been furloughed, a lot of jobs have been lost. That is also kind of pertinent in terms of which industries are supplying, which industries have sort of fallen. So certain industries like the airline industry or the accommodation industry or the hospitality industry or like restaurants and things like that have obviously all dipped because of COVID, but there are specific industries that have actually risen. Now these industries look more like healthcare, for example, insurance agencies, things like a lot of like governmental like welfare stimulus places and places like that, like for example Dole in the UK and Australia, a lot of those places have increased, have seen a lot of rise. Another set of the economy that tends to be growing very fast and very rapidly is fintech, so financial tech. So for example, if anyone is familiar with Silicon Valley of India, like Bangalore, right? A lot of fintech firms in Bangalore are booming right now because obviously of COVID, right? So these are good, just good things to know that these are very good bits of information to know to counter any assertions made in debates about how the economy is changing in a COVID era. The best way to sort of be well read up on this stuff is doing that reading yourself. Again, just like sort of just doing quick Google searches as to what happens in terms of workforces, staying up to date in like news media and that sort of stuff, like following the stocks of basic corporations can really help here, especially when you see like a lot of stock buybacks and things like that that are happening in current status quo, right? So that's really helpful. The next thing to sort of remember and the next sort of things to sort of be aware of is stimulus packages that are being passed across the world. So the EU has passed a stimulus package last week. The United Kingdom has passed a stimulation package 3 days ago. The US has passed stimulus packages a few times now. I think like just understanding how the stimulus packages are passed, and sort of like even just knowing which ones are passed can be really helpful. Again, all of this is, again, very easily accessible through a quick Google search, but just good stuff to know and do reading on. Another quick thing to also keep in mind is stuff about regional trades, trading blocks, and free trade agreements, right? So in the COVID era, there is a lot of free trade that is being affected directly, right? So for example, there is a lot of states, like for example, the EU, the UK, currently in a free trade agreement. The UK is is in agreements with a lot of independent states. Australia and China are both in new negotiations for free trade. India is actually new free trade agreements with the UK. A lot of these things are being affected by the coronavirus right now, especially because of the amount of goods that are being imported and exported between states, right? Because there's a lot of states that are unwilling to take particular goods. There's a lot of states that are asking for more goods, particularly pertaining to healthcare provisions, things like PPE, things like protective equipment, like plastic, just basic raw materials as well, coming from a lot of states that extract. So things like iron ore from Australia is being exported at a much higher price. These are really good things to know, because I think that affects how you probably impact out a lot of these arguments if those happen, right? So those are good things to know, just free trades. Also knowing how blocks are functioning right now. So the European Union right now is not in its best condition. ASEAN itself is working pretty tightly knit. So just like reading up on blocks, a lot of these are just quickly accessible by just reading the news every day. So this is really good stuff to keep in mind. The last thing that I think I will say in terms of coronavirus is it's really good to see how states themselves are funding particular areas of the economy, right? So right now, most states have sort of deprioritized funding for schools, especially in places where schools are sort of shaky as to whether they're going to open or not. So for example, in the UK or in a lot of European states, economies and governments have sort of barred the amount of funding that they're allocating to schools and have started plowing it in other places. A lot of these places are redirecting the money that they would have previously put into schools into things like healthcare, into things like Medicare, into things like, just like basic provision of resources, welfare, food, shelter, those sorts of things, so that people can stay safe in these like COVID eras. But that being said, there are also states that are putting it into military investment. One of those states that's doing that is actually India right now. So that's good to know, because I think that can be really good information for anyone who's like maybe running a case about what the state is prioritizing right now. What does funding look like? Where is it being allocated? These are really good things to know for debates like that might happen. I realized that a lot of that was just suggestions as to what reading you should do. I don't particularly want to give away anyone's emotions that they've set in the last few weeks. I realized that there's a few of the CAs at this tournament who've talked to me about that, so I didn't want to give anything away. But that being said, I did want to give people heads up about things that they should read for coronavirus. I'm not saying that these are things that will definitely be run. These are just polite suggestions from me as to what I think would be really pertinent in terms of an economic angle for people to read up on in terms of coronavirus. Hopefully that makes sense. Did anyone have any questions pertaining to COVID specifically or COVID specific economic stuff? If anyone wants to put them in the chat bubble, I'd be happy to answer that, because I do know that there were some questions. I didn't actually get the list of the questions that people asked. So if you do have particular questions, I'd really appreciate it if you could put that in the chat. I didn't actually get a list of questions. So if you want me to answer oh, okay, cool. Yeah, so I get a question about UBI during COVID. So UBI, firstly, for those of you who do not know, hopefully most people know this, is Universal Basic Income. Sorry, the person who asked the question, could you just ask me a more specific question? Like, are you asking if it exists? Are you asking if, just a little unclear. Should it be given? Okay. Well, personally, I think it should be given. No, I'll actually answer it. So this could be a potential motion, right? Yeah. So one of the things that happened in the United States a few months ago, actually, was that every United States citizen, well, so I wouldn't know this because I actually am not a citizen, but no. But every United States citizen actually got $100. What was it? Sorry, $1,000 in the check in their like mailboxes to be able to like use as UBI, given that a lot of people were furloughed or let go of, right? So this is a policy that is gaining traction very quickly around the world. That being said, there are also a lot of European states that previously already had UBI that was existing. So this is like, I think this particular debate is something that we see a lot in the US, because the US does not have a UBI. This might be something that you see more in like I said, in Southeast Asian states, because again, there's a lot of those places do not have UBI. But this is a motion that you might be seeing in the next future. The reason why there might be a stronger case now to provide UBI is obviously for the following reasons, right? Like there are economies that have quite literally collapsed. There's a lot of industries that are not functioning like they used to function. And so obviously this is a good time to perhaps help those people out. The cases against UBI being given are things like, if you give people money, that doesn't necessarily solve anything. People would hoard that money. People wouldn't spend it. You wouldn't get like reinvigoration of the environment, economy, right? People wouldn't like re-spend it in, and you wouldn't get the consumption and the sort of benefits that you get from consumption in the economy. So that might be a potential off case to run against that. Another thing that might be really helpful to know as well is that although a lot of states do not provide direct UBI or do not provide like a universal basic income or a bare minimum income, a lot of states do provide very good welfare in terms of like dole, which is the social security provision that you get in Australia and you get in the UK, and a lot of like states like Finland and Sweden. A lot of those dole provisions have gone up significantly. So for example, in New Zealand, the dole provision has gone up significantly. It's gone up by like 24% or something, which is a large number. So that means that a lot of the provisions they're getting, like things like healthcare, things like basic like food coupons and food stamps and things like that, those have gone up significantly. So although the UBI itself has not gone up because they don't have a UBI, other provisions of welfare have gone up. So another variation of this particular motion that you might see is something along the lines of, should governments increase welfare? Should governments increase like subsidies? Should governments increase things like food coupons and things like that? So that's a good variation of the motion. That's a really good question. Thanks for asking it. Hopefully that answered it. If there are other questions very directly pertinent to COVID, or any questions that people put in the form, again, I did not get to see those. So if you want to put them in here, I can answer them. I do apologize for not seeing those earlier. Okay. So I think I've sort of talked about COVID specifically. Hopefully that answered most questions that people had about COVID. Well, about economics in COVID. Obviously I can't answer much about COVID, but it is really good to, again, sort of talk, like to look back on all those things and try and do some reading and try and relate that back as to why in current status quo it's important. I do want to caution a few things as a judge, right? Although it's really important that people talk about like the current relevance of a motion, and obviously a CA team, when they set a motion, they set it based off what might currently be happening in status quo. It's never very wise to cater your entire case to, we should do this right now because it's COVID. That can be one mechanism in a case, but when you have it entirely structured around this one reason, it is much easier for an op team to get up and just be like, okay, this is only relevant during COVID. This is not that important, right? So try and make your cases more general and more generally applicable. And obviously try not to go into a tournament right now. I know that the temptation is very strong, but try not to go into every round and make it all about COVID. As an adjudicator, there is nothing that is more saddening. So please don't do that if that's possible. But yeah, okay. Should countries borrow as much as they can right now to boost their economy and worry about paying their money later, or should they be conscious about their debt? So a lot of these questions are sort of in the framing of like, I'm assuming that these are like just questions that you're asking for arguments on both sides, because I'm presuming you don't want my particular opinion. Yes, okay, cool. Okay, yeah. So it depends who they borrow their money from, right? And it depends which countries. Like, it's very easy to centralize these questions down to a few. So for example, if these countries are countries like Japan, who currently do not have a huge debt, but have a lot of, they don't have a lot of debt from other nations, but other nations owe a lot to them, this might be a good time to collect on those debts, right? This might be a good time to owe that back. That being said, if you are a country like Australia, which has a lot of debt to China, now may not be the best time to apply that policy to. It also depends on who they're borrowing from, right? So for example, the IMF of the last few months has like very clearly tightened its policy as to who it lends to and how much it lends to, right? Because there is a greater case for need right now. The same thing is happening through the European Union. So for example, when Italy was very badly hit by the coronavirus, and when Spain currently right now is still suffering with very high amounts of coronavirus victims, obviously the European Union has made it much harder for them to borrow money off the general, like the central banks and things like that, right? So it has become a lot harder to collect that money. So it's not really even about whether countries want to borrow money. It's more so as if they can, because a lot of like loan provision institutions have made it significantly harder for them to contain that money. That being said, in terms of like paying off debt in the future date, the one thing that's currently happening in the economy right now is the uncertainty of it all. So it's incredibly uncertain as to whether or not, as to when the economy is going to recover and how and to what degree it is. So that obviously makes states a lot more risk averse and makes them sort of cautious as to how much they borrow, because no one wants to be kind of in a situation of like 2008, right? So that's kind of in terms of borrowing money. Hopefully that answers that. Okay, I think moving on, if there's not too many other COVID questions, if there are any questions, just pop them in the chat and I'll answer them as soon as I can get a little like segment. So just before I move on to like strategy in terms of like econ cases, because I think this is the stuff that I think is very pertinent, right? Because the other stuff you could have probably Googled and found out on yourself. But I think this is more just me judging a lot of rounds and like just being in a lot of economics debates and sort of seeing what strategy works and what strategy doesn't work and what's really good stuff to do and what's stuff that you probably want to avoid doing. But before I jump into that, there's just some general things that I think people should have a working knowledge of. And I'm not going to sit here and explain these because these are longer things that I think you need to just sort of read on yourself. But I'm going to give you a list of just basic things that people should definitely have a working understanding of. And you should just do some research. Perhaps if that's not today, do that by the, like, I know you guys all have tournaments, have a tournament next weekend. So try and do some reading before then, right? Like, I'm not saying that this is what Enting's gonna run, but I am saying that this is definitely something that you should probably try and read on. So here's some general things that I think people should know in terms of economics specifically. So the first thing is you should probably know what the 2008 financial crisis was. You should know why it was created, like, you know, like what should we do to ensure that we don't get things like that again. Right. You should probably know about bailouts specifically in terms of the EU and EU policies. This includes things like Greece. This includes things like Italy. This includes things like Spain, right? So like know what the EU looks like, how does it function, how do bailouts within the EU look like? Because there's a lot of motions about those, particularly if you go to things like Australs, right? Then also know, and this is really important as well, but like know the different types of blocks, right? So know like NAFTA, TPP, ASEAN, BRICS, know how they sort of function, know which countries are like the strongholders within the nation. So for example, obviously in BRICS, China is a really big actor right now, right? In ASEAN, like you know, like maybe Myanmar's like actions are or are not being condemned. These are good things to know, right? Know in NAFTA what role the United States or Canada has right now, right? So these are always really good to know, and it's like just I think good stuff to know in terms of like blocks. Also know what major economies look like what, right? So the amount of times that people have gotten up in like debates and said things like China does not have a capitalist economy is ridiculously high, right? Like I think that this is when you get sort of butchered by opposition teams. It's not necessarily that you're going to lose the debate, but it is necessary that like you are definitely going to be laughed at by the opposition. So just know what basic economies look like. So whether they're capitalistic in nature, whether they're absolutely government like interventionist, whether there's not much intervention from the government and they're more liberal, like know those sorts of know the difference between like the Singaporean economy to like perhaps something like Austria's economy, right? Which is like far more less. So Singapore's very heavily government regulated. Things like Austria are not so regulated, right? So I think that those are really good to remember and to just know the major economic differences between those economies. Those are really helpful. And I think the last thing that you should definitely know are things like international aid. How is it provided? Who provides it? And why is it provided, right? So obviously international aid is provided by things like the WHO, you get it from like the IMF, you get it from a lot of international, like the UN, you get it from a lot of international organizations, but you also get it from a lot of hegemons in the world. So like the United States has US aid that very directly provides funding to a lot of like nascent democracies. It provides it to a lot of like developing nations. It provides it in a lot of states in Africa. So yeah, these are just good to know. How is it allocated? Who allocates it? Why is it allocated? And how can it be revoked if it does get revoked, right? So these are all really good questions to know, because there have been like a lot of debates in the last like 5 or 6 years that are said about this, especially at international tournaments. So this is just good stuff to know. So hopefully that's some good stuff to know in terms of like examples and things that happen there. The last thing is that I think that you should definitely know a little bit about is sovereign wealth funds. There was a recent motion that was set at a tournament that happened last weekend in the US, which was the Women and Gender Minorities tournament for that area, which was on sovereign wealth funds, and the amount of people who didn't know what that was kind of scary. So know what a sovereign wealth fund is. They are usually funds that are created for the diversification of economies that are usually largely one sector oriented. So if for example, Saudi Arabia might have Saudi Arabia has a sovereign wealth fund, which is meant to diversify its economy because it's largely oil based, right? So in case, so they use that money to try and invest in other things that aren't oil, just so that they are like regionally diverse or economically diverse. So it's really good to know about sovereign wealth funds, know about the Malaysia case that has recently happened, the IMDb thing. So that's really important stuff to know, right? So like read up on sovereign wealth funds. So I think that that's kind of what I had in terms of like what you should read on. I sort of covered stuff as to like the things that I thought were really pertinent in like economics motions. I want to talk a little bit now about what to do in round when you hit motions, and when is the best time to perhaps run, like when not to panic and when to panic, right? The answer to when to panic is never. Don't panic ever. But okay, so let's quickly talk about when is it that a debate is about economics? Like how can you identify that a debate is going to be about economics? Most people think that when you have a motion about the economy, it means that you're going to have a debate about economics. That is not the case, right? Oftentimes, when you have motions about the economy, the debate isn't about economics. It's about things like social policy, criminal justice, like IR, like international relations, environment, marginalized communities, or laws and policies. What do I mean, right? So good examples of this are things like this House would abolish the minimum wage, right? That motion sounds like it's going to be about economics, but it's not actually about economics, right? It's in fact about what happens when you abolish the minimum wage. So it's actually asking you, like, who does the minimum wage affect? It largely affects like underprivileged individuals in society who probably make very little. So like poorer individuals in a society, right? So it's asking you about a marginalized community and how are they affected. So it's not actually an economics debate. It is a very clear marginalized community social justice debate, right? So that isn't economics. So that's good to remember, right? Something like this House believes that states should seek to prioritize reducing income inequality over GDP growth, right? Again, this is asking you to directly impact out a minority group. This is not an economics debate. This is a clear allocation debate, resource allocation, right? It's not really economics. It's more about prioritization over one group of another, right? So that's really helpful because like income inequality is obviously focusing on poorer individuals, and GDP growth is focusing more on middle-class individuals. So it's asking you to prioritize one group over another. It's a social justice debate. It is not economics, right? This House believes that central banks should set limits on government spending. That again is not a direct economic debate, right? That's a debate more about whether the government ought to provide benefits to individuals or whether it should prioritize its own government growth, right? Economic growth. So again, it's a prioritization, it's a social justice debate, right? You can run economics arguments, but it is not necessary that you need to. You can just run moral or principled argumentation, or you can run practical argumentation based on social justice and it will work just as fine, right? Another one is like this House would place a special tax on men in Western liberal democracies, right? Like on like men's incomes, obviously. that is a very clear social justice debate, right? Like that's obviously, it might even be a feminist debate, right? These are motions that sound like they have a lot of economics arguments, but they're not necessarily economics. Why am I telling you this, right? Because I think people see economics debates or see debates which have words like tax or central banks or like prioritize reducing income inequality, or like there was a motion recently that was set at a Northeastern tournament, which was like this house would elect a official for the central bank by popular vote. That is a pure like democracy motion, or it's a pure international like local like democratic motion, right? Or like policy motion that has nothing to do with economics, right? So it's really, why am I telling you this? Because it's really easy to see these words and be like, I have to only run economics debates or economic arguments. That is not the case, right? In these motions, you are trying to run whatever argument will get you the closest to providing the best access of resources or the best necessary outcome for the group of marginalized communities that you are trying to address, right? So for example, this house would abolish the minimum wage. It has nothing to do with what economic policy is the most sound. It has everything to do with what can best help poorer individuals, right? So like there could be moral and principled argumentation that you run here that would win the debate. I think the debate that I adjudicated actually had moral and principled argumentation with it, right? So this was really good stuff to know. The reason why I'm spending so much time on this and stressing on this is because it's really easy to sort of be swayed by what is and what isn't an economics debate. Just ask yourself, is it asking me to sort of prioritize one group over another? That's always social justice. Is it asking me to talk about social policy or criminal justice or IR? That's usually all the others. The other really important reason I'm telling you this is because, and it's sort of leading into my next sort of question, which is what happens if you go into a round and it's something that you have absolutely no idea for, you've never read about the economics and you don't know what to do, right? There is a few things that you should do to ensure, and like, look, if you don't know absolutely everything in the round, I'm not going to lie to you, you will take the one. But it is much more likely that if you do these very things, you are much more likely to take a 1 or a 2 over like a direct 4, right? So what are the things that you should do in a world where you go in and you don't know anything about the round, and you don't know anything about economics, right? The first thing is, see if you can run a principled or moral case, right? So I think we talked a lot about this, like for example, in bailout policies, we talked about like moral hazard, right? Like, should it be done? Right? I think these are also like motions that you can run where like you could run an argument of something along the lines of, does the government have the autonomy to do this? Is the government the best actor to do this, right? Or should individuals be able to do as they put like free will arguments, like moral philosophy arguments? These are like these sorts of arguments that you can sometimes cater to every sort of economics debate and still win if you do a very good job at it, right? If you impact it out and prove and weigh very clearly as to why you would probably outweigh even the best economics argument. So that's really good to know, right? So firstly, try and see if you can run any principled or moral argumentation, even if you don't know anything about the economics motion, right? Secondly, try and see if you can make that a politics or IR motion, right? So ask yourself, if this were to happen in this country, what would happen to all the other countries around the world, right? Like for example, if we I'm trying to find a motion, hold on 1 second. If we set a limit on the government spending in the United States, what would China do, right? I think China would try and step in and perhaps try to provide a lot of those aspects for us, right? So what would that do on an international relations level? These are really good ways to come up with back half extensions, especially in really good rooms where your top half maybe burns all the economic stuff, right? This is a really good way to come up with like good politics and IR motion. The specific importance here is that politics and IR motions tend to be very clearly linked with economics. Most of the times they're very similar. So it's very easy for you to make that link between politics and IR. So that's quite helpful. The next thing you can do is you could turn this into a social justice motion, right? Like whether like sort of talking about a marginalized group or a marginalized community, right? A minority community. Sort of make that debate about them, even if it isn't necessarily about them. Talk about a particular group or talk about a particular set of individuals, whether that might be the middle class citizens, that might be the richer individuals in a society. Talk about why we prioritize that particular group. And why that particular prioritization will probably beat out anything else in the round. Do the weighing there, and I think that's a clear way of still winning. And the last thing, and this one's really important too, say you don't know anything about a sovereign wealth fund, right? Like say you don't know absolutely anything, like you have absolutely no idea what that is, right? And you go into the round and and you're now panicking. Instead of panicking, try and make that entire round about what you think a sovereign wealth, like about the bigger principle behind it, right? So for example, if there is a motion which says something like, this house believes that we should use sovereign wealth fund funding, like the principle that comes from it, into investing on welfare, right? If that's the motion and you have no idea what a sovereign wealth fund is, just maybe talk and make the debate about welfare, right? Because like it's talking about using the money from this one thing into putting into welfare. So maybe if you're in government, explain to me, why is it that welfare is a good thing, right? Like this is not the argumentation that will get you the 1, but it is probably the argumentation that will get you a strategic 2 or a 3, which is much better than taking a 4, right? Like if you just went up there and you completely butchered the round and you didn't know what sovereign wealth fund is, right? Try and relate it back to the core impact that you want, right? And that can really be helpful. That is very similar to any examples that people throw to you as well. This is where I want to give that advice too, right? Oftentimes people will pick up like very niche economic things that have happened in the world and sort of throw them to you. This can happen through a POI, this can happen through like within a case, this can happen when people like ask you like direct responses and or do direct refutation to your case, right? Remember that even if you do not know the example itself, the underlying principle behind that example can always be refuted, right? For example, if someone talks to you about the 2008 financial crisis, but you have no idea what that is, right? But they say, okay, like this is bad for like housing and we shouldn't let banks take so many risks, right? I think that you sort of know what the argument's about, right? It's about banks taking risks. So respond to banks taking risks. Don't respond to the 2008 crisis. You don't need to. You just need to respond to the argument, not the example. Good judges will never prioritize examples over analysis. So always try and make sure that you like answer the analysis over the argument, right? So that's kind of what I had in terms of like, what do you do if everything else goes wrong? You could try all of those like strategies just to make sure that in a world where you don't know the exact economic principle, you can still probably engage in some degree in terms of like the debate, and maybe not take the 1, but at least take a strategic 2 or 3, which is much, much better than taking the 4, right? So that's kind of the content that I had for you guys. That is sort of what I got sort of communicated that people were interested in. If people have questions now, I'd love to open it up to like a question, and because I know we've been going for about an hour and a half, and that's kind of the time frame that was given to me. So if people have questions specifically pertaining to like anything that is like economics debate related or anything COVID related, I would be very happy to answer these at this point. I just wanted to leave some time for people to answer, like ask any questions about anything I've said today, but also stuff that I maybe perhaps didn't cover that you wanted to hear stuff about. You just want to put it in the chat. Okay, so I will hang around for a bit. I will wait for like 5 or 6 minutes just on the chat. If people do not have any more questions, I again want to thank everyone for having me. It was a privilege to talk to you all. Hopefully people were able to take something away from that. Again, like I said, this was a very rudimentary introduction to how to debate economics. Yes, of course, I would be more than happy to provide those. So okay, I'm actually getting questions, so let me answer these. Are there any specific resources we can refer to? Yes, there are plenty. So there is, if you go on YouTube and you type in European debating resources, there is a set of lovely individuals, a lot of world CAs, a lot of good friends of mine, a lot of EU DCCAs who have all made introductory videos on debate. There's a few on economics. There are things like financial resources. There are things about like monetary and fiscal policies. There are things about speculations. There are things about like how stocks and things like that work. So that's really that's really important to sort of like look through. That has a lot of like obviously videos. if you go on the same site as well, there is a spreadsheet, like an Excel tabulation spreadsheet, where you can click on that, and there will be a few links there as well, like into like just things that you can read. Other than that, if you do want other resources in terms of economic stuff, I think another really good thing to do is to just hop on sites like Hello Motion, or look at other online tournaments and things like that, and look for motions where you can see some economics motions done. And sort of just like try and maybe break. This isn't really a resource, but this is just more of a strategy. I know I'm sort of deviating away from your question, but this is a strategy to sort of help prep for economics motions. If anyone's trying to work with their partners to like sort of prep this out, find old economics motions, prep with your partners, come up with arguments for like all 4 teams. Like, so come up with arguments for opening government, come up with arguments for opening op, come up with arguments for CEG, and then CO, right? That's a really good way to learn more about that motion, right? Afterward that, if you need to do like Google searches, or you need to actually like do some reading, that's a really good way to learn more about motions. The reason why it's a good idea to look at motions that have been run in the past, especially in the last few years, is because CA teams often tend to borrow the general idea and then tweak it a little based off like new news and things like that that have been added, right? So I think you guys saw that with the COVID motion, for example, the COVID bailouts motion. So bailouts motions are very common, but that particular motion that was set by a friend of mine, he added the stipulation of like, there's no restrictions now because of COVID, right? So if you'd already prepped what a bailout motion was, I think you could have used a lot of the analysis in that particular debate if it happened, right? So it's really good to sort of look at those. But other than that, yes, definitely look at those videos online. They're European debating channel. There's some there. There's also others if you just search for Australs debate resources on YouTube. There's also a lot of videos made by Australs debaters. So that's kind of the resources that I have for you. Hopefully that answers it, Sanika. All right, I have another question, which is, in the motion of this House supports rapid global elimination of tariffs and non-tariff measures, how can the Gov support the idea of elimination being rapid and not slow? Oh, okay, all right. So I presume that that's just asking me, how do you run the OG case, right? So there is actually a lot of, so this motion was run at Worlds Thailand, so I'm not sure how many people attended, but this is actually a really old motion, has kind of been recycled. So there is probably around somewhere online, if you want to search it up, where I'm sure that there's like some really good argumentation. But the way that I'm seeing that the most strategic, like, or the quickest OG case that's coming to my mind right now is this idea of rapid elimination of barriers often means that people cannot, so that the trading happens immediately, right? Because no one needs to wait for the barriers to be removed. So it happens immediately. That means immediate interjection and injection of capital into others' economies. That means that you get rapid growth that happens immediately. So rapid growth, like rapid elimination, also leads to rapid growth. That's probably good for immediate injections. I think that especially if you apply that right now, you could say things like the economy, or in times of fiscal crises, or in times of like financial crises, this is probably very helpful because it happens immediately. And provides relief to a lot of people who have either like lost homes or jobs, and et cetera, et cetera. So like rapid elimination probably means rapid growth. That's a really clear, I think, OG case. I think another thing that you could run probably here is, sorry, I'm just kind of on the spot. This is just me spewing stuff at 1 o'clock. What else would you talk about? Rapid and not slow. Yeah, I think another thing that you could talk about is, for example, if a state were to immediately get rid of barriers, how would it change industries immediately, right? So I think, for example, one of the things it would do is it would probably promote the sorts of industries that currently have a competitive advantage. So that's probably good because you increase competitive advantage that happens as a whole. So that's probably a good thing as well, right? So just like increased competitive advantage that's occurring all across the board. It also probably stops any like corrupt governments from being able to like tweak these because it happens immediately. So governments don't have the time to adjust or adapt. So it probably like helps out in states like Venezuela where there's a lot of political strife, right? So that's probably good. Those are just like 3 arguments that I literally don't thought of right now. Those are probably not the best arguments. They're just stuff that I'm thinking that would probably be strategic to run from opening government, because one of those dealt with like the political stuff, the stuff about Venezuela. The other 2 sort of talked about the general idea of like why growth as a whole is probably quick, and quick growth leads to like immediate injection of cash and capital into states that are already like fiscally not very good, right? So I think that was probably clear stuff. Again, this motion definitely is recorded. If you go to WDC Thailand, there's probably a lot of rounds where you can watch that. So that's probably helpful. Could you elaborate a little bit more about why FDI would increase through trade blocks? Yeah, so if Japan currently doesn't, so like BRICS, right? BRICS has, I think the example I gave you was about BRICS. So BRICS currently has Brazil, Russia, India, China, and I'm literally struggling with the S. I think Sri Lanka, right? So here's why, sorry, it's Singapore, I think. So currently, Japan may not have the best confidence in Brazil because Brazil's economy is one that is stagnant over a few industries, right? So Brazil, for example, does a lot of like teak, oak, like farming and things like that, right? So it's not the most confident economy in the world. It's not like the highest GDPs or anything like that. It doesn't have the highest import-export ratios. It's not the most strong economy in the world. So maybe Japan doesn't have the biggest incentive to go and invest there. But now when it exists as part of a bloc, that means that its economy is tied to other stronger economies like India and China and Russia, right? All of which are quite like competitive, to quote, right? So now because it's tied in, it knows that if it invests within Brazil and something goes bad in Brazil, India, China, and Russia would probably jump in and try and help out because their own like resources and capitals and investment are also tied to Brazil. So they wouldn't let it go down, right? So I think that Japan is more assured that it's going to get its return on investment quickly. That's kind of the analysis as to why you're likely to get FDI increasing in smaller states in trade blocks, because now those like other states that would not have invested in those small states are now likely to have, because they have the backing of larger states within that trade block, right? Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So since any trade agreement helps with comparative advantage, what is marginal benefits of trade blocks? Okay, so like trade blocks specifically have a lot of advantage in terms of like, sorry, I'm not sure if that's Meg's question. I hope that's Meg's question. Okay, so if you have a trade deal with China, so currently, firstly, trade deals are very hard for smaller states to broker, right? So not every state has an ability to garner trade deals, right? So for example, Myanmar doesn't really have the ability to garner a trade deal with the United States because the United States does not want to trade with Myanmar, right? It's a very small state which doesn't offer as much to trade. However, when Myanmar is part of ASEAN, it can now trade with the United States. It has more ability to, because it like leverages power through like bigger states like Singapore and Thailand and like Malaysia, right? So firstly, not every small state has the ability to compete to have a trade agreement, so it doesn't always have like a comparative advantage. Hopefully that makes sense, right? Because smaller states do not have the ability to have trade agreements, so then the question of comparative advantage never really arises. So that's the first marginal benefit. But secondarily, even if it's a medium, like a medium level state, so like a state like Bangladesh, for example, which does have the ability to have some trade agreements, it is much better when it's in a bloc, because now it doesn't only have to trade with one country, it can trade with multiple, and it's much easier to do that in terms of a trade bloc, right? For example, Bangladesh is part of ASEAN, right? So it makes it a lot easier for it to trade with like a multitude of states at the same time versus having to individually go and have comparative advantage trade deals with every single state, right? It also increases the amount of states that you can have a comparative advantage with, right? So now Bangladesh doesn't just have to work with India, it can work with like 16 other states and have 16 other comparative advantages, which probably helps its efficiency as a whole. So that's kind of the difference as to why one trade agreement versus a trade bloc.